Oliver Bear Don't Walk. Oliver Bear Don't Walk, the fourth, is a citizen of the Crow Nation and a postdoctoral scholar at the University of Washington. Oliver's research is at the intersection of clinical natural language processing, fairness, and ethics. Their thesis focused on the technical and ethical aspects of extracting patient-level socio-demographic information from clinical notes. Oliver's current research focuses on applying intersectionality to fairness audits of machine learning used to support the care of patients with HIV and working with Indigenous communities to identify Indigenous social determinants of health and extract this information from the electronic health record when appropriate. Oliver is grateful for the community support which has brought them this far, and as such pays it forward through teaching, mentorship, and serving as an organizer and faculty for IndigiData and a member of the steering committee for the American Medical Informatics Association Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee, and a director for the American Medical Informatics Association's Board of Directors. So we are so grateful and so lucky to have Oliver Bear Don't Walk here with us today. Now I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you, Maggie. Let me go ahead and get my presentation sharing. Let's see. Okay, and the obligatory, can everyone see my shared screen? Okay, yes, I'm assuming it's up. Great, thank you. So great, thank you for having me here today. It's a privilege to be talking with y'all. I'll be talking a bit about my personal journey through academia to where I am today, with an emphasis on Chief Planiku and how his teachings have influenced and guided my decisions. So I'll give a bit of background on Planiku as well as myself and my family, and then I'll progress through my educational career from undergraduate to master's and PhD. And then I'll talk about a little bit of the future work I'm planning on doing and where I see my career going. So a little bit about myself. I'm a citizen of the Apsáalooke Nation, and I grew up in Everson, Washington, about 90 minutes north of Seattle, pretty close to the Canadian border. And in these pictures here, I think this should be on your top right of the screen, is during my graduation with my PhD in summer 2022. My mom, my dad, and my partner all came out and celebrated with me. Just below that is a picture of my friends from undergrad. They all came up after my graduation and celebrated too. They came up to Everson, Washington, and my dad just cooked food for us. We hung out, we went exploring, and when we all tucked in at night, we all kind of slept in the living room. And my dad said it reminded him of him when he was a kid growing up in Lodge Ross, Montana, and all the cousins would just kind of sleeping all over the living room, and he said it really warmed his heart to have us all there. You go to the other side of the slide, those are two cats. One is Ishpiwishke, or Snuffers, and the one below her is Matai. And then the center of the picture, or the slide, is a picture of my partner and I. We went to a road trip around the Olympic Peninsula, and this is our time when we were going for a hike through the Hoa rainforest. And then the picture just beside that, it's in black and white, is a photo of one of my ancestors shot in the hand. He's wearing conch shell earrings. You can't see, but I'm wearing conch shell studs today. And I think I mentioned I grew up in Everson, Washington. So I didn't grow up on the res. My dad moved off when he was, I think, 18 or so. So I go back as often as I can, but I've spent a lot of my time growing up in the Washington area. And so this is a picture of the original Bear That Walk, or Bear That Doesn't Walk. He was born in the early 1800s, and the way he got his name was he was seeking a vision. He went off by himself into the hills, and one day he saw in a distance on a ridge a really small speck. And he couldn't tell exactly what it was, so he started walking down from his spot and then up the ridge to go see what it was. And he saw a grizzly bear sitting on a hill and was waving at him. And the grizzly bear instructed him to place his hand in the grizzly bear's mouth, and he did, and he couldn't feel any teeth in there. So he knew it was a really old grizzly bear that was too old to walk anymore. And so he took the name Bear That Doesn't Walk, or I'm going to try and pronounce this, Dachba Che Gilasesh, which is the original Crow name. And he has scalps on his shirt in this picture. So he was fearless when he went to into the battlefield, because he knew that he would grow up to be an old man. And that was some of the power that he got from that vision. And next to him is his wife, Sees the horse, and you can see how much he loves her with the smile on his face. And it's funny because I think my dad and I both get a smile on our face when I look at my partner and he looks at his wife, and it's just, we know we're kind of being annoying, but it's out of love. And her name is really important as well. Sees the horse. It means that she, horses meant wealth in our society, and so she was able to find this wealth, not just within a financial sense, but also within a familial sense too. And so that's a little bit about myself and my family, and now I'll provide a little bit of background on Chief Pleniku. So Chief Pleniku, his life teachings have influenced a lot of who I am and the choices I've made so far within my education. He was born around 1848 and passed away in 1932. And during that time, he proved himself to not only be an amazing warrior, but also a leader and a visionary for Crow people and how we live our lives. So he was born into the old ways, but he was also a part of the modern Crow too, with how he saw things changing and how he interacted with Europeans and updating our ways as Crows. He was the last traditionally elected chief of the Crow people, and his lessons, actions, and words have an impact even to this day on Crows. One of his more famous quotes really struck with me early on, and I think I actually use this quote in all of my college applications, from undergrad to master's to PhD and even to postdoc. And so the quote is, "Education is your greatest weapon. With education, you are the white man's equal. Without education, you are his victim, and so shall remain all of your lives. Study, learn, help one another always." And so this quote's been really important to me throughout my entire career. But there's other aspects of Pleniku and his wisdom which I've really respected. And one of those is his guide. Another teaching comes from his vision of the four winds charging a dark forest. He watched as each tree within that forest was brought down by these strong winds. And he also worried about the other living creatures contained within that forest who made the trees their homes. But there was one tree that stood alone that was still standing. And this is an excerpt from, I think this is, let's see, Pleniku, Chief of the Crows by Frank Lindemann. "In that tree is a lodge of the chickadee. He is the least in strength, but the strongest of mind among his kind. He is willing to work for wisdom. The chickadee person is a good listener. Nothing escapes his ears, which he has sharpened by constant use. Whenever others are talking together about their successes or failures, there you will find the chickadee person listening to their words. But in all of his listening, he tends to his own business. He never intrudes, he never speaks in strange company, and yet never misses a chance to learn from others. He gains success and avoids failures by learning how others succeeded or failed, and without great trouble to himself. There is scarcely a lodge he doesn't know, and yet everybody likes him, because he minds his own business or tends to it." And so what Pleniku learned from this vision of the lodges and the countless bird people who were in those trees, which had fallen, and the chickadee who's the only one left, he had learned that he would need to develop his body, but also his mind. His mind would lead him to power, not just the strength of his body. So these are the main lessons I've learned from Pleniku, reading books about him and hearing stories from my father and other people within my life. That education is my greatest weapon, and it's what I need to gain to be able to advance within this world. That I can learn from the failures and successes of those around me, so I shouldn't gloat when others fail, but be there to help them and to learn from their experiences, and not to become jealous of the successes of others, because you can learn from them still, and to also be careful when I speak my mind. I also learned that there's a balance between physical strength and mental strength. Plentiku didn't focus only on his mind, but also had great feats as a warrior too. And this idea of balance between powers is something that I would take to other places in my life as well. And finally, we have to be willing to adapt. Plenty was looking to the future with 1 foot in the old ways and 1 foot in the Western ways. And this is another example of balance that he brought in his life. So Plenty didn't know exactly what would come next in his life, but his lessons and our cultures still ring true today. I think this is because he was firmly grounded in the culture of his people while also keeping an eye on the future. So that's a little bit of history about Plenty, a little bit about my family and where I come from. So now I'll talk a bit more about my journey through my education and how Plenty's lessons have applied. So I left my hometown of Everson, Washington to attend Stanford University in 2011. And this was the first time I had left home, especially for an extended period of time. I left my family behind, and it was really difficult. Community-wise, I had to form new networks to make sure that I was supported and that I had community around me and that I had friends who would not only help me study, but also take me away from my studies every now and then because, can't be studying all the time. And academically, this was also a very challenging time in my life too. I was really going through a transition from doing fairly okay in high school to, doing homework on the bus just doesn't cut it anymore. I actually got a C during my first year, and that was new for me. It was kind of a wake-up call of just how much work I was going to have to do to succeed in this new environment. I had taken an intro-level math class and was also humbled by that. I started that course with about 5 or 6 other natives, but by the end of the quarter, it was just me in terms of Native American students. And this was the start of being in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics classes where I would be one of the only natives present. But in this course, I did get better quarter by quarter. By the third quarter, my professor pulled me aside and told me something that I won't ever forget. He said, "Oliver, I've seen how hard you've been trying and how you've struggled with some of the newer concepts. But I want you to know that this quarter, the material will be new for everyone. And that's going to give you a leg up because you know how to struggle and how to endure. Your classmates may not." And during that quarter, I actually ended up getting the second highest grade in that class, which was a sense of pride for me, but also a lesson that no matter where I was coming from, as long as I was willing to struggle and endure, things would get better. And so I also took a computer science course, and I think this was during my sophomore year, and got another C in that class. And it's funny because computer science, or CS, is what I do now. It's all a part of my research. It's a part of my entire education career. And when I first took this class, I was actually incredibly intimidated by my peers. A lot of them had grown up with computers, with tutors and classes that allowed them to begin programming and learning how computers worked. They had parents who were computer programmers themselves, who were engineers, even those who were professors. But I remembered that I enjoyed the material that I was learning, even if it was hard, and that I could struggle and endure better than a lot of my other peers. And so class after class within my computer science curriculum, I started to get better and have a better grasp of the material. But during this time, I was really focused on keeping my head down and listening and learning and just making sure that I could continue moving on towards my goals. And as I mentioned, community-wise, it was kind of difficult as well. I was often the only Native in my class. I didn't have any Native American faculty as lecturers or educators during my STEM classes. So I did have to look for community elsewhere. And so I lived in the Native American themed ethnic dorm, Muwekmataruk, and I made friends with a lot of great natives who are, still in my life today. Back a couple slides, I mentioned my friends coming up to celebrate my graduation with me. Those are all the friends I made. Those are all friends I made during undergrad, and we still get together as much as we can, as often as we can. Some of them are having kids and settling down, and it's wild to see where they started off in college and seeing where they're at today. And so I'm also thankful for the faculty and staff at Stanford as well, who created a space for us to hold our events, to study, work, to chill out. And these were super important for me just to find a sense of community within all the hectic classes I was taking. So I majored in math and computational science, and you can think of that as more just applied mathematics with an emphasis on theory, but also computer science and how we apply math within computer science. And a big part of this was machine learning, which is defined as computer systems that are able to learn and adapt without following explicit instructions by using algorithms and statistical models to analyze and draw inference from the patterns. And that was really what I enjoyed. The reason I enjoyed math was because I like looking at the world around me, finding some of this data, and trying to understand what are the patterns that are going on within the world around me. And computer science really helped with that because you can only do so much of that through spreadsheets or hand calculations, and computers allowed me to crunch really big numbers and to speed up how well I could work with the data. So I graduated in 2015 with a Bachelor of Science. And what you see on your screen here is not only my parents coming up to celebrate my graduation with me, but also a blanket ceremony, which is really important and still means a lot to me to this day. This was at Native Grad, and all the Native graduate students came out. We celebrated. Our parents had a chance to come up on stage and give a talk. And if anyone's listened to elders talk, it can go on for a while. And so it was a very long ceremony, but it was great just to hear about everyone's experiences and their cultures and to celebrate everything we had done. And so towards the end of my class, my career in undergrad, I started going to career fairs. And a lot of the jobs I was looking at were people, saying, we want you to work with the data we have. This is internet browsing data, their travel data, what kinds of shops they like to go to, and identify what's the next product that someone wants to buy. Where do they want to travel to next? What's the next restaurant that they're going to want to go spend money at? And while these are interesting problems, and there definitely merit to be solving those problems, I didn't feel that anyone's life was going to be drastically changed by recommending they go and get something from DoorDash or go to McDonald's down the street. And so I went into a field known as biomedical informatics. And biomedical informatics allowed me to use my skills from data science and machine learning with biomedical data to help improve people's lives. Because getting my education is just one part of following Pleniku's teachings. Being able to help people was another important part. And so biomedical informatics is absolutely a handful or a mouthful to say. There's a lot going on there, and it's kind of hard to understand what it is. In fact, a lot of us in the field kind of stumble into biomedical informatics, and we don't really know what it is until we find out that we're doing it already. But biomedical informatics is a field that covers a lot of different disciplines, but focuses on working with data for advances in medicine and biology. And it underpins a lot of the healthcare infrastructure and organization that we have today. So that part is all about biological data, genomic data, tissue samples, etc. The medical part is about clinical data, diagnosis data, clinical notes, which are notes or narratives that clinicians write about patients, us, whenever we go into the clinic, and it helps them pass information along to the next clinician. This can also include imaging data like X-rays or MRIs, as well as qualitative data. So that can look like interviews on patients and how they perceive health outcomes after an intervention, or how clinicians perceive a new medical device that they get a chance to use. And then the informatics part, which is really my bread and butter. So this is using data to generate knowledge and insights. And so part of this is computer science to be able to manipulate large data sets, machine learning to find patterns, deep learning to create really amazing predictive models, as well as generative models, which if anyone's seen ChatGPT, that's a part of deep learning. And then math and statistics so that we can base our approaches in theory and rigor. And then another important part is human-computer interaction, which allows us to understand how our software and models and data infrastructures are working for patients, clinicians, as well as their communities. So biomedical informatics has been really an exciting field for me because I get to use someone's data, and not only do I get to solve really fun problems with that, but now I get to kind of come through on some of my responsibility to do something that's hopefully going to improve their life. For example, a problem I work a lot with is modeling health outcomes for patients with HIV. And I work with data from patients with HIV because these outcomes are so dependent on adhering to medications, coming to appointments, and managing your health with not only by yourself, but also with your care team. And this health management is affected by a lot of extra clinical factors, factors that affect our health outside of the clinical setting. Things like access to stable housing, stable transportation, domestic abuse, family support, etc. And so one outcome dependent on these factors is if a patient will miss an appointment in the future. And just the fact of knowing if a patient is going to miss their next appointment can help clinicians intervene. So if a machine learning model I built takes in a patient's data during a visit and then pings a clinician, this patient is likely to miss their next appointment, whether that's in a month or 6 months, then a clinician can intervene and ask this patient some questions. Maybe they ask the patient, hey, how are things going? Do you think you're going to be able to make it to your next appointment? And how is it making it to this appointment? And the patient might say, well, I've been having trouble making car payments. My car actually just broke down, so I had to take the bus. And the bus actually doesn't really run that often out where I live because it's in a rural area. And then this allows a clinician to connect the patient to hospital services, which maybe there is a transportation service for the hospital for certain patients to make sure that they can make it to the next appointment. And so these extra clinical factors, like transportation usage or stable housing, can be contained within clinical notes. And as I mentioned, clinical notes are written by clinicians about us every time we go in. This can include our diagnoses, the medications that we're taking, but this extra clinical information is usually contained within something called social history, which is just our history outside the clinic. And so I found my passion for machine learning with text data to be able to extract this kind of information about patients from their clinical notes. And so my research focuses on developing approaches and tools to extract this kind of patient information from clinical notes. And I started getting into that around the last year of my master's. It was around this time that I also started interacting with PhD students and realized that PhD students are human too. They're a lot like me, and that maybe one day I could do that as well. But I was still keeping my head down and focusing on my schoolwork, but now I was starting to think about what kind of impact did I want to have with an Indian country with the education that I was getting. So in 2017, I earned my master's in biomedical informatics, and I had my second blanket ceremony. And because I couldn't get enough of this field, I went into a PhD for biomedical informatics as well. And it was around this time that I really started to think about what impact I want to have on Indian country. How is it going to take my education and my research and make sure that I was bringing it back to Indian country to have a positive impact on the communities that had been supporting me along this entire way. So early on, I wanted to focus on machine learning models and how we can make them more efficient to work on in lower resource settings, like an IHS clinic, for example. But I had left behind my community for a second time. There were no Native faculty within my department. I was at the School of Medicine, and there really wasn't a Native community up there. The undergrads at Columbia had pulled together a really great Native community, but it was just hard to make it down from the med campus to the undergrad campus. And so it was hard for me to continue feeling connected with my people and then also directing my research in a direction that would allow me to work with Indigenous people and our data. And so, as I mentioned, there weren't any faculty who were Native within my department, and my advisor was an amazing advisor, wicked smart, really knew how to do natural language processing, machine learning, and I really respect just, all the knowledge that she was able to impart on me. But she had never worked with an Indigenous student before, and I don't think she knew how to guide my research and connect me to working with Indigenous researchers. So during my education, I drifted further and further away from working with health data for Indigenous people to focusing on improving health for people within marginalized communities, and then just a purely technical focus on improving machine learning and deep learning efficiency for text data, which is, again, a very exciting problem, but it was very far away from what I wanted my focus to be. And during the summer of 2020, with the murder of George Floyd and the reignition of the Black Lives Matter movement, was when I really had my if not me, then who moment, and started asking questions about if I want my research to have an impact in Indian country, then I really need to be the one to move it in that direction. And so within my department, my peers and I really questioned what we were doing to fight racism and other forms of systemic discrimination within our work, because we started realizing science is an objective, it's not a view from nowhere. It's full of biases and the lenses of how we view science from a Western sense, and we want to confront that. And this was hard because I was still trying to keep my head down, not rock the boat too much. I just wanted to get my degree and get out of there. And I was really listening to some of Chickadee's powers there. But then I remembered that Plenty also learned about balancing his mind and his body. And I think the idea of balance there is really important to me. As an Indigenous person in higher education, We have to keep balancing ourselves and how safe we can be within these different environments and making sure that we can survive, get through, and bring something back to our communities. But we had to balance that with standing up for what's right, even if it puts us in a bit of danger. And so this led to my peers and I writing a letter to our department calling for change in how we discuss the socio-legal context of healthcare and health education, how we recruit and support students and faculty from marginalized communities, and how we engage with communities whose data we rely on. I also entirely changed my dissertation topic about 2 years before I would graduate, which did kind of ruffle some feathers within my committee, but I did have the support of my peers and my advisor to do that, which I'm thankful for. So my dissertation focused on machine learning methods to extract race and ethnicity from clinical notes. And the reason we did this is because race and ethnicity data is often missing for a lot of different people when we come into the clinic. It's just not recorded within the electronic health record system. But it's also sensitive information, and it may be missing for very important reasons. And we can't forget that race and ethnicity categories are political. So I also focused on the ethics of this kind of work, and I measured any biases that these models trained to extract race or ethnicity from clinical notes might learn when they're extracting this kind of information. For example, a model might learn that explicit mentions of a patient being Native American, for example, patient's Native American, patient is American Indian, are good to infer race or ethnicity, which is great. Those are the kind of examples we want these models to be using. But they may also infer this kind of information from data that's not directly related to being Native American, like mentions of disease, mentions of mental health or drinking. And this really would not be a ethical model if it was using that information to infer race or ethnicity, and that would account for some kind of bias for that model. And so I really enjoyed this kind of research because, it wasn't just me keeping my head down anymore, but kind of making my own choices on what I wanted to study and really moving in a direction that I thought would allow me to take something back to Indian country. And a lot of these risks really paid off for me. Out of that letter that my peers and I wrote, we founded the Justice Informatics group at my department, which I still work with today. My dissertation work is much more aligned with the values and beliefs that I have. And it also allowed me to step into leadership roles within diversity, equity, and inclusion committees within my department and within the American Medical Informatics Association as well. And I was really sort of lifting my head up and finding a voice for what I wanted to do. So I graduated from Columbia in 2022, and these are a few photos of that graduation. There's a smaller photo up there, and I hope you can all see it, but it's right next to the Columbia logo. It's my mom and dad and myself. I brought them up to the 20th floor of the New York Presbyterian Hospital, and that's where my department was located. And I brought them up there, and from that point, you can see all of Lower Manhattan. You can see Queens, so Bronx, part of Brooklyn, and you can even see Yonkers if you look up north. And you should have seen them up there because they just like turned into little kids, like seeing how far and how much of New York you could see. My dad, being from Lodgegrass, I'm sure was used to seeing pretty far out there, but I think this is totally new for him, and it was a lot of fun bringing them up there. Little did they know that's just where I had my morning cup of coffee before I would go and start my research. But it was really great to bring them up there. So at this point, when I was graduating, I had about 11 years of schooling after leaving high school. 6 of those have been spent with a great community of natives. Even if I was only native in my class, I still had a community to come home to. And 5 I'd spent fairly alone without community. And so for my next step, I wanted to make sure that I could go to where I would, 1, have an impact on Indian country, and 2, be able to find community and like-minded scholars who wanted to work with Indigenous folk who were Indigenous themselves and really make an impact through healthcare. So shortly after graduating, I started my postdoc at the University of Washington in the Department of Biomedical Informatics and Medical Education. And the center picture here is a trip home to Everson, Washington to see my dad and sister. And this was my first time back home in about 3 years since the pandemic had started. And it was my partner's first time visiting my hometown. And so we did what everyone in a hometown does is a small town. We went down to the river and we skipped rocks. And that was her first time doing that actually, so that was really fun. And none of us could beat my dad I think there's just something about growing up in the res that makes you really good at skipping rocks. And so it was here at UW that I felt I could truly combine the Western education I received with my culture. I had the support of my faculty and my advisors here to continue my technical love of machine learning and text, but I also had the support from my department to pivot and focus on Indigenous communities and our health. And so a lot of this time I had spent, well, during the first year, I spent time building relationships with Indigenous researchers, community health organizations, as well as elders and community champions. And the reason I started doing that was because this was what I felt was missing from my work previously. I was working with people's data, but I didn't really know the people who had provided me that data. And I wanted to have a chance to integrate in community, to get to know who I was working with, and then to allow community to drive the research that I could work on, because these communities know what the important problems are that face the people within the community. And it's my job to translate as best I can from what they know into research, and then bring in grants, fund research, and make change. And so, like a lot of my math courses, actually, this has also been a humbling experience, trying to reconnect with community. Because remember, I spent 11 years away from community, focusing on my education and not really being able to take as much time to participate in my own culture. And so when I first approached the Seattle Union Health Board to work with them, I knew that I was an outsider with my training in Western research. So I expected there to be some mistrust and myself to have to work to gain that trust, but I don't think I was ready for the skepticism, the level of skepticism that I met. But I look back on it now and it really does make sense. The Seattle Indian Health Board and community health organizations like them are inundated with requests for research from Western researchers. And just because I look the part doesn't mean I'm actually ready to do right by the people I'm working with and to remain accountable. But I'm lucky that they took me under their wing to give me training in how to do this research in a respectful and responsible way. There's also another time when I was meeting with a Tlingit elder to talk about what kind of research I should be doing. And at the end of the interview, I did what my dad had taught me, which when an elder tells you a story, you shake their hand and you slip them a little bit of money. And he kindly declined. And I felt incredibly sheepish after this happened, but he was really nice about it and taught me that it just wasn't something that they did in his culture. And so not only would I have to learn more about my culture, but also adapt to how different tribes handle these kinds of thank yous, this form of respect, and how they treat their elders. So from all of this, it was obvious that Western education wasn't all I needed. After 11 years from home, I need to get Indianized again, as my dad would say. And so now I'm thinking about my work in Indian country and wanting to focus on my Crow education as well. That means visiting my dad, my home back in Crow, my cousins, reading more books about our history, going to powwows, sun dances, and just generally being present for ceremonies and my own culture. And this isn't just about my research. It's way more than that. This kind of Indianization is a form of healing for myself and for those who come after me, and it's also a form of resistance. So that covers my academic journey, and now I can start talking a little bit more about my research that I want to focus on going forward. And this is going to be a bit of a pivot to the more academic side, but I promise y'all there won't be any calculus equations on there. I'm keeping an eye on the time, and I might be a little bit behind, so there may be some that I need to cut, just so I leave time for questions. So my research focuses on social determinants of health, and these are factors that impact our health that happen outside the clinic within our daily lives. These are the extra clinical factors that I was talking about before. This can include housing status, drug use, transportation, demographic information, as well as many others. And clinicians care about this kind of information because if you know this context about a patient, then you can tailor interventions to meet patients where they're at. So for example, if a clinician wants a patient to get more exercise and they're advising them on how to do this, if they don't know that the patient lives in an area where there's limited green space, there's disinvested parks, and there are dangerous roads to walk on, then this advice really won't be that helpful because even if the patient wants to act on it, they may not have a space where they can do this safely. And so where we get this kind of data, these social determinants of health, is within the EHR, or the electronic health record. And these are hospital records in a digital format about our clinical data. So our diagnoses, our lab values, our clinical narratives, and there's a lot of good structured data that contains some of these SDH categories. But often our data is missing or inaccurate, where we just don't know if we have a good answer, if a category applies or not, or the information we have is just wrong. It's actually hard to tell those two apart in practice, but I keep them here for just the sake of being complete. And finally, we might have inadequate SDH categories, where these categories are too coarse or they're not well defined, and they just don't truly reflect reality. And so one way to deal with these kinds of issues is by leveraging another source of data, the clinical narrative. This can allow us to recover missing or inaccurate data and even have access to more granular information too if we mine it from the clinical note. And this can be performed manually or can be performed through natural language processing, which is using machine learning methods to identify and even extract SDH data from clinical notes. So natural language processing is a collective term referring to the automatic computational processing of human languages. And this has a lot in common with machine learning, but it differentiates itself in that it works with text data. So NLP methods can take in text, they can take in structured data, they can be multimodal and work with both at the same time, and they can be used to generate new text. Maybe they're used to extract information or to classify inputs. And NLP can be an end in and of itself, or it can be part of a much larger pipeline that uses its output. For example, using NLP as a tool to extract keywords or phrases from text for storage, visualization, or analysis. And as I mentioned, my dissertation focused on race ethnicity as a social determinant of health and extracting missing information from clinical notes. I've actually done a lot of other work with this kind of social determinant of health data in clinical notes, especially focused on patients with HIV. So there are some issues with the SDH I've been working with, and this really urged me to start thinking about what I would want to do differently. So for one, they're incredibly focused on the individual, their behavior and identity and choices. When we know that there are forms of structural systemic oppression that impact our health, like racism, sexism, transphobia, anti-Semitism, and colonialism. They're not informed by community voices. Sometimes they are, but often they're not. They're predominantly driven by clinicians and researchers, so they do have their validity, but that's just one lens to view social determinants of health through. And finally, they're not Indigenous. So I asked the question, how might we as Indigenous people view this extra clinical information and how it could impact our health? Would we measure one's cultural connection or the strengths of their culture, their resilience, their ties to extended family, the health of lands, animals, and spirit? So these are all factors that we might take into account if we were to go through and design our own Indigenous social determinants of health. And what really got me started thinking about this is how my models to extract social determinants of health would interact with my dad if he went to the clinic. So let's say he goes in and he talks to a clinician and he talks about using peyote or tobacco in ceremony. Well, I question if the doctor would understand the cultural significance and protective benefits of ceremony. Would they view this from an Indigenous informed lens or they view it from a Western lens? And then taking one step further, what would a model do if it encountered this kind of information within a clinical note? Were these models trained with Indigenous cultures in mind, or would they flag this as drug use and tobacco use? And this isn't just an academic exercise. There can be real world impacts from models inferring this kind of information that can lead to biased or inaccurate care. And so this is where a recent grant I submitted comes in. I submitted a training grant to help me transition to faculty in the near future, which focused on culturally congruent social determinants of health for Indigenous people, what I refer to as Indigenous social determinants of health. So this project is titled Collaboratively Identifying Population-Specific Social Determinants of Health for Indigenous Patients Living with HIV, from patient perspectives to the electronic health record. So in this grant, I propose to first describe ISDH from patient perspectives through qualitative methods, as well as community-based participatory research. And part of that is because I want to build these community partnerships to help us drive research that's important for Indian country and to guide us on the ethical applications and approaches that we should be using when we're doing this kind of research. Next, I want to identify ISDH within clinical notes. And so this is natural language processing to mine this kind of information from clinical notes, seeing if patients describe it this way, ISDH this way, then how do clinicians understand that? Do these categories show up within the clinical note? Do they not? Are they changed? These are kind of the questions I hope to answer with this aim. And then to measure the predictive power of ISDH for health outcomes related to HIV. And so if we can use machine learning to model health outcomes using ISDH and show that this kind of information offers new perspectives on health that aren't captured by traditional social determinant of health categories, then we can really start to show clinicians that this is information you should be paying attention to and use within your clinical practice. And so for this, we're elucidating ISDH from three perspectives: the patient and the community, the data-driven perspective through clinical notes, and then the health outcomes perspective through machine learning for health outcomes related to HIV. And so I pulled together a mentorship team for this project. And on that mentorship team, I am two Indigenous faculty: Jason Dean, who is Blackfeet here at UW, and then Vanessa Simmons, who is Crow at Montana State University. And so I'm in the process of applying for faculty positions as well with this grant, which we don't have yet, but we're hoping to get a notice of award or not pretty soon here. I'm going to skip through this a little bit, but I'm happy to talk about it later if anyone wants to. But I've been thinking more about what I want this research to look like 10, 20, 30 years down the road. And I think there is a future for Indigenous Informatics Institutes, where we work with our own data from IHS to drive research. So then we wouldn't be dealing with this issue of our data being too small for statistical analysis. Often I see our patients thrown out of research because there's just not enough Indigenous patients, or we're lumped into this other category and there's no help for us or no good information that can come out of that. And Abigail Echohawk actually calls this data genocide, and I think she's correct, because if we can't even study our own health outcomes, then there's no way we can truly help our people. And so we'd have access to all our own data right there to drive our health initiatives forward. We just need a way to govern that data and the infrastructure to work with it. And so I'd love to see how this kind of work could be used to implement new health initiatives driven by tribal governments, or to implement tools within tribal health clinics and IHS clinics that are driven by Indigenous researchers that can help our people. So I'm going to skip to the next part of this really quickly. But what I would love to see is developing tools for clinicians to use within patient care. So this Indigenous social determinant of health tool that could then extract information and point clinicians to the correct clinical notes to understand a patient. Or if tribal leaders came to a clinic and said, we want this new health initiative, but we need the data to know if it's going to be the right health initiative, and to help us get funding for it. And then we go and mine that data from Indian Health Services, and then we can show that, yes, this is an important health outcome and we should be funding it. So I'm excited about where these kinds of projects will go. I'm excited about the future of Indigenous informatics, and I want to continue following Planiku's advice into the future. And I think some of this advice will have to update as I go as well. So with respect to education being our greatest weapon, Western education might make us a white man's equal, but traditional education gives us access to knowledge and ways of thinking that go beyond Western knowledge systems. Chickadee's power to always be listening and learning is important, but we can't remain idle with so many injustices in the world affecting our people and so many other people. We can equip ourselves with this knowledge that we gain from listening, so that when we speak, we can cut through to the core problems and insights. And this balance between mind and body used to mean focusing on working out and sports, but also my academics. But I think now what it also means to me is focusing on research to help us understand the world, but then not neglecting how this research needs to be implemented so that we can actually make impacts. And finally, we need to be willing to adapt. I spent so much time adapting to Western views, education, and research just to survive. But I look at what the Western medicine and our research has done to Indigenous people, and I think we have to go the other way too. We have to adapt our Indigenous knowledge systems so that we can heal our people, because quite frankly, the world needs Indigenous wisdom. I want to thank you all for the opportunity to speak here today. I'd like to thank my dissertation committee, as well as the people working with me on this ISDH work. I've been able to take risks during my career and rock the boat at times, mostly because of my community and the peers who have supported me so often. I wouldn't have been able to leave home, go for my degrees, or find my voice if it wasn't for my communities. And I wouldn't have been able to do this if it wasn't for my parents as well. So thank you to my parents for supporting me every step of the way and being at all my graduations. Thank you all for listening. I'm also happy to take questions. And I wouldn't be presenting to a native audience if I didn't plug my sister's Instagram, who makes really amazing beaded jewelry. So if you like to get in contact with her, her Instagram handle is up there. If you want to get in contact with me, my Twitter and email are up here as well. And I'm happy to take anyone's questions now. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Oliver. That was a fantastic presentation. I just absolutely loved all of it, but especially your lessons learned and then your lessons learned for the future was just really impactful. We are just really grateful for your time, for your words, for your presentation. So we have about 10 minutes. Happy to answer any questions you may have or comments that you may have. Feel free to just unmute yourself and go ahead and start speaking.
I have a question, Oliver. First of all, I would like to write a letter to your university, Columbia University, and tell them that they did wrong and that they need to make it right, and that that our students should not suffer to gain that kind of knowledge. Secondly, in your comment about the lack of Indian perspectives in social determinants of health, you mentioned the cultural aspects, but didn't elaborate further than that. And what immediately jumped to my mind was our young men would go out and have visions, and their power comes from a chickadee or it comes from any other animal. And that being native means that you fully expect to encounter the supernatural and to have a relationship with the supernatural. If you said that to a doctor, they might throw something from DSM-5 at you as a diagnosis. So can you speak to that a little bit?
Oliver, we lost your audio, which I don't know why. It doesn't appear we've done anything different.
Is that better? Is that if I take
Yeah.
Yeah, that's okay.
Great. Yeah, they worked the whole talk and then they stopped there. Yeah, that's a great point. So I'm hopeful that those kinds of conversations about culture will come up during the interviews and the grant I want to work on. But the other aspect is then education, not for patients, but for providers. And I actually had some great conversations with some faculty here at UW who work on education for medical education. And so being able to work in these Indigenous social determinants of health into education, this research on bias, and just making sure that medical students understand that there's different conceptions of health. And it's not just about your physical and mental well-being, but also your spiritual well-being and your cultural well-being too. And I think that's a bit beyond the work I can do, in 5 or 10 years, but I would love to see that kind of work done by Indigenous students going through medical programs. So yeah, I think you have a great point there, and I'm hopeful that this kind of research can draw clinicians' attention to these conceptions of health.
Thank you.
Oliver, I had a question. So you spoke to the idea of finding a community was really, really important to you. And then in that time, in those 5 years of your education, in your later part of your education, when you didn't have it, it kind of pulled you away from your native community, and then also made it harder for you to focus your academics and your research on an Indigenous communities. So for others who might be finding that similar situation, do you have any kind of recommendations for what they could do to hold on to that community?
Right, yeah. I think my recommendations would be, especially going through grad school, summers are when you have a little bit more leniency. And so making sure that you're going home as often as you can during that time. I was fortunate to be in a program where I could do a lot of my work on the computer, and which allowed me to go home and work remotely. I also found community in, my non-native peers as well, who, though didn't entirely understand where I was coming from, they, were queer, they were Black, they were from other marginalized communities, and they understood some of the struggles I could talk about. And so that kind of community was also very important. And that took a lot of vulnerability on my part and their part to start, building community and having these kinds of conversations and being there for each other during not just difficult science, but also dealing with difficult emotions and just, going through a PhD program and everything. But yeah, I think that would be my advice.
Thank you. So we do have a question in the chat. Do you have any writings about Indigenous determinants of health and PLWH that we could read?
So so unfortunately, I don't offhand right now. I'm working on a literature review with a student here at UW who's also Indigenous, to start just seeing where is the field at with Indigenous social terms of health in terms of interviewing patients. And I'd be happy to pass along some of that information. But when I was writing this grant, I did find mentions of, I can't remember who exactly was doing this work. I think they were down in Oregon, but patients who had HIV, people who were living with HIV, would have to travel back and forth between urban and rural settings quite often, because maybe they lived in an urban setting and that's where they got the care, but then they went to a rural setting because that's where their family was. They were going to sun dances, they were going to ceremonies. And so I think that will also be another SDOH that pops up in this kind of research. But off the top of my head, I don't have any. I think that's a gap in research right now. It's just what are the specifics of SDOH for people living with HIV?
Wonderful. Do we have any other questions, comments?
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
May ako nga, erosa ako nga, kipaklo ako nga, kaganak ako nga, mangyak ako nga. Alak na kami nga, kuipag nga. My name is Valerie Tony, and I work at Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium as a research associate. Forever an undergrad student. I spent the last 9 years helping my son go through leukemia, and then upon relapse, helped him through bone marrow transplant, something that everybody knew was going to be very difficult. When he was first diagnosed, they warned us that we're going to need therapy, PTSD therapy, as a family. So that was 9 years ago, and we just entered into therapy. One of the things that came to mind was my mom's words, and her words were, umiyon, your mentality will take you to new horizons. And I've seen that, so I've lived it. And with her words, I was able to help safeguard my son. He was 14 at the time, to help him through treatment. And one of the things that we learned, we're afforded 4 times in a day, in a 24-hour day, to meditate. to become one with the universe. In the English world, it's called meditation. I wasn't able to do 2 of those ceremonies, and they are ceremonies every day. You you greet the world, you made it through the night, and you present yourself to the universe. This is me, this is who I am. And I'm still on this world. I claim to be on this world. So I did a lot of ceremony when he was in treatment. And at least twice a day. And he survived to this day. You know, he was the only one that walked out of that when we were living down there at Seattle. So, and he still receives care on occasion, a couple of times a year at UW. So we still live in that world. And I understand it. I understand co-production, and I can see it when I see co-production. I name it for the flower that has bloomed and call it out. Because we had to live in both of those worlds, that became so important. So my question to you, so I just told you my credentials, right? So my question to you is, I've seen our way of life and the path that we take importance with certain aspects of our human animal being. And then I see the Western science perspective. They intersect. It's very rare that they're meeting up. And I had to fight a lot for it and using my words. Fortunately, I was versed in medical jargon so I can understand it. So I understood a lot of what you're saying. Since our goal is to converge these worlds, to do a co-production, you're gonna end up having to do a lot of redefining of the terminology. Even from the Western science perspective. And I really appreciate you. I see so much application that you can do. And I think I might end up having to work with you because you have the brains. I'm so happy that you went through school and you can use your education to better assess Indigenous people. It just makes me want to bawl because I've been trying to find a tool to merge those. And it's been just hard. I've been working at it for 1.5 years and I haven't found one. And I think yours is the most promising. It just comes down to redefining. And are you open to working? I work up here at Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium as a research associate. Just because I was so used to reading study after study, trying to help my son stay alive. Are you open to something like that?
Yeah, Valerie. Well, first, thank you for sharing that story. It really meant a lot to me. And the importance of ceremony, because I know not entirely comparable, but for me, getting through my education is thanks to my dad always performing the ceremonies back home and everything to protect me. But yes, I would love to work with you and people like you who have more knowledge than I do of the experience and what it's like, on the ground in Indian country. I have, this Western education, but I also have a lot to learn and unlearn too, to truly do something good within Indian country, because given my Western education, there's a chance I could do harm if I'm not careful. So it would be people like you that I would rely on to help me educate myself and learn how to do this work responsibly. So absolutely, I would, if you want to follow with me afterwards, I would love to see what kind of collaboration could go.
Oh yeah, no, thank you.
So we are just a little bit over time. Does anyone else have any other questions or comments for today?
I wanted to say, how did you balance your mind and body? I'm a high school student and I go into psychology classes because I'm trying to get into psychology. And a lot of my friends and students are taken back to it because it is a very Westernized thought going into psychology. And they kind of get upset with me by those choices. But when I go into my classes, a lot of psychology reminds me of the teaching from my elders, from my ancestors. And you stated we need to adapt to Westernized standard thinking, but I see it as they need to adapt to us because a lot of mindsets in psychology I see like my elders have already answered. And doing research, especially heavy topics like Alzheimer's disease that I've done research papers about, I treat it like how we are taught when we go into dancing, that you have to go in with good spirit. You have to cleanse yourself. You have to have a good mindset. If you do not have that, then you cannot dance. And so when I do my research, it's important for me of where my mind is at and where my body is at. If I am not right for my body, I run, and I run at dawn because that's when we do our prayers. I try to do as much as I can to stick to culture because I know psychology will colonize your mind. And it's important to me to stay decolonized and keep to my culture. So I was wondering, what did you do going throughout your educational journey?
Yeah, I think you have a great point too. Sometimes it feels like to survive, you have to adapt to Western ways. In some ways you may have to, but keeping one foot in the door at the very least of your traditional ways, going back home as often as you can, and make sure you don't lose sight of that, because being able to challenge academia with these indigenous knowledge systems is really important to be able to do. And in terms of, exercising both my mind and my body, it was realizing that like I'm not just going on a run because I want to, look good or stay fit, but because it was good for me mentally too. It gave me time to think and to let my mind wander. And it was a way for me to connect to my culture because, crows were great runners, before the horse got here and everything. So it was just putting myself and my mental health first to be able to make sure I went out and ran. And I have had friends who do what you do and do it at very important times, running the morning before dawn and everything. So I think as long as you can schedule that first and make sure you put that part of your day first, you'll be in a good spot to continue doing that throughout your education.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
All right. Anything else from anyone else? Well, Oliver, once again, thank you so much for being here with us today and presenting to us. And for those who are here, thank you for being here. We appreciate you as well. And that is it for today. So alrighty, thank you all so much. Take care.
Thank you for having me.